She's a moment, such an innocent, beautiful moment of vital creature that cannot be left alone. Every day, man, to perfect needs us, pure sense of wanting to be enjoyed. For her, I like that in the night, my eyes of fabric, eyes of hair, and the rough fiber, hot shotgun, make a broken dance, just for the big suit, that music destiny of the greatness of the God, definitely. The only reason for it's now literally, it was spoken by the wind, sing as a bird in Japan. With a smile and soul in my company, your inspiration, our example is so precious. So this is a dream, but to your beauty, that's a treasure. I know that now it is everything too. Come to your eyes, that's why I prefer you to look where you live, and I follow where you live. So I'm a listener, but this is what I dream. Died, leaving a widow named Rose. One by one, oh one by one, children came unto daughters, sentence sons. Tic-tac-toe, a tic-tac-toe, a take. Of a dad will bring to God the most difficult thing for her was to reside again. Thy will be done. Our young father died, leaving a widow named Rose. One by one, oh one by one, children came unto daughters, sentence sons. Tic-tac-toe, tic-tac-toe, take. Of the God will bring to God the most difficult thing for her was to reside again. She's
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, nosotros somos Radaid, un grupo de Guadalajara, Jalisco, México. Felices de estar aquí, de tocar para ustedes esta música que incorpora elementos de distintas culturas del mundo y es como una pócima para que las ideas se nos despierten y evolucionen en nosotros. Hello, good evening. We are Radaid from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. We're very happy to be here. And we gather up musical elements from all over the world to make something that we can drink, and it will just turn our ideas into something better for this world. Hope you like our music. Thank you. Deja que salga la luna, deja que se oculte el sol, deja que caiga noche para que empiece nuestro amor. Deja que las estrellitas me llenen de inspiración para decirte cositas muy bonitas, corazón. Yo sé que no hay en el mundo amor como el que me das, y sé que noche tras noche va creciendo más y más. Y sé que noche tras noche va creciendo más
Gracias. Esto que vamos a tocar, se los vamos a dedicar especialmente, es para hacerlos brillar un poco. Esto se llama Shine. Disfrútenla. I could stay on tonight like always. Kill the silence in my eyes and don't speak until we shine like always. Yeah. Your voice, I could stay on tonight like always. Kill the silence in my eyes and don't speak until we shine like always. Yeah.
Gracias.
Radaíz, de los grandes músicos de México, de Guadalajara. Bueno, compartirles que probablemente algunos de ustedes vieron la parafernalia antes de llegar a este evento. Y no solamente está en este espacio una arquitectura, un diseño que sobre la marcha iremos diciendo lo más importante, que es la gratitud. Pero vamos a empezar por la parte externa. Seguramente muchos de ustedes, y si no vale la pena, si no lo hicieron, poner atención, hay unas extraordinarias esculturas, unos atlantes. Hay unas obras magníficas de una intervención artística en los grandes maestros de México, de nuestro querido estado de Oaxaca. Tenemos esta puesta en escenografía de los migrantes a la salida y que vale la pena que todos la vean, la reconozcan, la recorran, al igual que los atlantes. Pues este maestro, con toda sencillez y grandeza como ejemplo de ser humano, es don Alejandro Santiago, quien se encuentra aquí con nosotros. Pido que prendan la luz y pido un fuerte aplauso por su trabajo, creatividad y generosidad. Maestro, es un honor. Muchas gracias. Gran trabajo, gran obra. Gratitud y amor a Oaxaca y al maestro. Bueno, de igual manera, ahorita platicaremos de nuestro próximo invitado. Tratamos de que las voces de los distintos intereses del futuro que tenemos que repensar se encuentren presentes en este espacio donde el tiempo es escaso. Y por supuesto hemos tocado temas educativos, temas de salud, de obesidad, de mente, etcétera. Pero uno fundamental tiene que ver con el cambio climático. ¿Y quién mejor que el doctor Pachauri, que fue parte de un grupo galardonado con el Premio Nobel, que dirige uno de los institutos del cambio climático más importantes en la Universidad de Yale, que se ha dedicado de tiempo, de fuerza, de alma, con todo, a pelear por lo de todos nosotros, nuestro ecosistema y nuestro mundo. Un aplauso muy fuerte para el doctor Pachauri. Pachauri, welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be here, and I hope what I have to say on the issue of rethinking our planet and our lives will provide some kind of a message for the G20. The reality is that the 21st century is going to be a century of knowledge. Now, using, acquiring, and fashioning new knowledge would really mean that we have to learn new things, but we also have to unlearn a few things, which means we have to get rid of some of the old myths and falsehoods that perhaps have led us to a path which is full of problems and difficulties. The reality is that we are affecting the ecosystems of this planet in a very serious way. Whether you deal with loss of biodiversity, the degradation of air, water, and soil, or for that matter, the problem of climate change, I think at the core of what we need to do as human society has to be new knowledge. And in this regard, let me say that there are two individuals who have probably given us a redefinition of economics who really don't come from the economics profession. The one person that I'd like to refer to first is Garrett Hardin, who in 1968 talked about the tragedy of the commons. The reality is when we utilize the commons, we find that private benefits far exceed private costs, and therefore we are imposing an externality on society at large and the good management of those commons. The other person who has taught us about economic theory, which really goes to the fundamentals of what would help us to redefine our planet and our lives, was a lawyer who became an ascetic and perhaps the greatest leader of the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi. And he indirectly referred to our preoccupation with GDP when he said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. And I really think we need to correct that direction. Of course, when you travel on the streets and roads of Delhi, everybody is going in the wrong direction. You're supposed to drive on the left-hand side of the road, and that's a hangover from our British colonialism period. But you find people all over the road. The point I'd like to make is that we really have to deal with these issues rather seriously. And I think we need to devise solutions which really cut across the very spectrum of development theory and development practice. And may I say, the role of knowledge is going to be paramount. As a matter of fact, Garrett Hardin, who I just referred to, said something very interesting. He said education can counteract the natural tendency to do the wrong thing, but the inexorable succession of generations requires that the basis for this knowledge be constantly refreshed. Now, the reality is that even if that knowledge is refreshed, there is a huge time lag and an enormous inertia, as a result of which we don't always utilize knowledge to the best advantage and to promote the welfare of human society. Now here let me refer to the problem of climate change. The fourth assessment report of the IPCC very clearly said that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And that's based on observations that are now abundant, that go back a long period of time, and there's really no space for doubt in coming to the conclusion scientifically that the climate of the earth is changing. But the other more important thing that we said was the fact that most of the warming that had taken place since the middle of the last century was very likely the result of an increase in the anthropogenic concentration of greenhouse gases. Essentially anthropogenic being human-induced increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. And when we use the term very likely, we're actually assigning a probability of 90% or more. Now, the impacts of climate change are already becoming very serious on human health, on agriculture and therefore food security, on the availability of water, and a whole range of conditions that really define the human condition. Now, in this regard, let me say that recently, about 7 months ago, we brought out a special report on extreme events and disasters. And that clearly shows that there is an increase in certain types of extreme events. To mention two of them, there is a very definite increase in the frequency and intensity of heat waves. So much so that if you project that human society, assuming does nothing to deal with the problem of climate change, those heat waves which take place currently once in 20 years, by the end of the century will take place once in 2 years. Now that is a very serious issue for us to tackle, because if you go back to say 2003, there was a massive heat wave in Europe, as a result of which over 40,000 people died. And we have data on a large number of places where these occurrences are now costing a great deal in terms of human life and property. The other finding that we came up with was that there is an increase in extreme events, both in intensity and frequency. So much so that in areas where the average rainfall is coming down and is projected to come down, most of it is taking place, or more of it is taking place in the form of heavy rainfall or heavy snow. Now, all of that poses very serious challenges in terms of how you're going to ensure that there's proper availability of water throughout the year, how you're going to ensure that this is not going to add to the risk to human lives, because clearly when you have floods, when you have an enormous quantity of water coming down in a short period of time, there is a major threat to everything human. So we really need to now find ways by which we can ensure that we deal with the problem of climate change at two levels. One is to ensure that we adapt to the impacts of climate change. And this requires scientific modeling. It requires projecting what the impacts are going to be in different parts of the world. It's not as though these impacts are going to be uniform. And that really requires science to be brought into the arena of policy making. The other thing we need to do is to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, all of the actions by which we can mitigate these emissions also tackle a whole lot of other problems. There are what scientists refer to as co-benefits. What are these co-benefits? Let's say if we were to use energy more efficiently, if we were to move to greater use of renewable sources of energy, then we would certainly be enhancing the security of energy supply across the globe. There would also be benefits in terms of lower levels of air pollution at the local level, which would imply a vast range of health benefits. There would also possibly be benefits in terms of new jobs being generated. And also, since the impacts of climate change on agriculture are going to be largely negative, then clearly reducing, eliminating, or halting climate change will certainly provide a much better opportunity for food security. And you must remember that human population grew at a very steady rate till the beginning of the 20th century. And at that stage, the population of this planet was 2 billion people. Today we are 7 billion. And in the next 30 years, projections indicate that we might add another 2 billion in this very short period of time. So food security is going to be an extremely important issue. Now, what I also want to say is that as it happens, renewable energy technologies are becoming progressively cheaper. We have brought out a special report in the IPCC which clearly indicates that the cost of renewables in some cases has come down to a level where it essentially competes effectively with conventional forms of energy. I can tell you that there are about 1.4 billion people on this planet who have no access to electricity. Over 2 billion use biomass for cooking and eating purposes in their homes. All of this carries huge health impacts in terms of the noxious emissions that people are going to inhale and are inhaling, mainly women and children. So one solution is to provide clean, renewable sources of energy. And I want to mention the institute that I am responsible for in India has launched a major program called Lighting a Billion Lives, where we're essentially promoting solar lanterns by training one woman in a village to charge all the lanterns during the daytime using a solar panel on her roof, and she rents them out at night to the entire village. So I think there are niche applications of this nature whereby we don't necessarily have to repeat what the developed countries have done across the globe, but where we can use technology to the advantage of the people at large, particularly those who are living in poverty. So in conclusion, let me say that what we really need to do is think in terms of all our actions, the path of economic development that we have pursued and its implications for the planet. And if we were to do that, then clearly knowledge will get us there. Knowledge will give us a new dawn for human civilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lord Nicholas Stern. La gente que sabe de políticas públicas seguramente reconoce ese nombre. El informe Stern es un parteaguas en las políticas públicas para el cuidado del medio ambiente. Su instituto de investigación Grantham, sus clases en la London School of Economics y sobre todo su proyección y su calidad humana hacen de Nicholas Stern una de las personas que más es no solo respetado, sino admirado aquí y en muchas partes del mundo. Lord Nicholas Stern, por muchas razones que él sabe y que algunos de ustedes compartirán conmigo, le damos doble gratitud por encontrarse hoy con nosotros. Lord Nicholas Stern, thank you very, very much for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. We're here to discuss the G20. The G20 should be about global responses to global problems. It should be about leadership in those responses. And that's where I want to focus, and I want to focus on climate change. The leadership must involve understanding the problem, communicating that understanding, a realistic strategy, and delivery. And I think we have to recognize that on climate change, as with many other of the global economic and social problems, they haven't done a very good job. And I want to try to give an indication, at least through one example, of how we could do a better job. Now, we have to begin with understanding that the two defining challenges of this century are overcoming poverty and managing climate change. If we fail on one, we fail on the other. Obviously, the disruption caused by unmanaged climate change would undermine the environment for creating and for overcoming world poverty. Similarly, if we try to manage climate change by putting obstacles in the way of the material advancement of the poor people in the developing world over these next 20 or 30 years, we will not be able to put together the coalition which is necessary to manage climate change. We fail on one, we fail on the other. There are many examples like that where leadership can fail because the things that really matter are not combined in the way that the logic of the problem requires. I could go on with examples in Europe. Europe's crisis has become a global problem. Unless Europe puts its short-term responses together with its medium-term growth story, which must be a low-carbon growth story, it will fail to deal with the short-term crisis. That we can talk about another day. My focus here is on climate change. The communication, I believe, and failure in leadership to communicate has been a real barrier to making progress. We have not managed to explain in a way that people really understand and can get their hands around the magnitude of the risk that we face. Unmanaged climate change gives us, over a century, 30, 40, 50% probability of 5 degrees centigrade. We haven't seen that on the planet for 30 million years. It would cause hundreds of millions to move and no doubt result in extended and severe conflict. That's the magnitude of the change. The magnitude of the risk. The magnitude of the response is that we have to divide emissions per unit of output by a factor of about 8 over the next 40 years. We have to divide by 8 over 40 years, and not, of course, all in the 39th year. That is a new energy and industrial revolution. We have to get people to understand the magnitude of that change. But the next step is the excitement of how that change can and will work. If you look back at past industrial revolutions, they involve 20 or 30 years of investment, innovation, growth, discovery. Discovery is at the heart of those processes. And in this case, it's not only the transition itself that's exciting, but where we're going is a much more attractive way to produce and consume. More energy efficient, more energy secure, cleaner, quieter, safer, more biodiverse. So it's not just about getting the magnitude of the risk across, it's the nature of the response, the scale of the response, and the attractiveness of the response that we have to do much better than we have. And we look to leadership to do that, as well as we academics and others having to produce the arguments and civil society get involved. Leaders have to put this across. But this is an industrial revolution, an energy industrial revolution, that has to be driven by policy. It has to be driven by disincentives, prices, regulations to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. That's a key aspect of policy, but it's not the only aspect of policy. We have to deal with other market failures. We have to deal with market failures that inhibit research and development. We have to deal with market failures that inhibit the emergence of networks, public transport, electricity grids, recycling and so on. Those networks cannot function without support from public policy. That doesn't mean publicly owned, but support from public policy. I could go on. Failures in capital markets are fundamental in this context. So too the importance of information, and so too the prices on goods which are not currently priced, like biodiversity, which can be profoundly affected and improved by policies on climate change. So having seen where we have to go, we have to get specific about the policies that are going to take us there. Now let me just focus on the first one for the minute. The first one is the greenhouse gas story. Prices and regulations, fundamental. But also, if you're thinking about getting the right prices, you can at least start with getting rid of the wrong subsidies. The subsidies on hydrocarbons around the world, $300 or $400 billion a year, immense, are an absolute disgrace. They give all the wrong incentives, they waste public money that could be going into education, R&D, fighting poverty across the board. The G20 has declared against these subsidies on hydrocarbons many times. Leadership now surely demands that there be a specific date for ending those subsidies and specific methods for getting there. It's not hard to do, but the lack of specificity has, in this case, I think, really hampered progress. And it's really hampered delivery because there are no clear criteria against which to hold leaders to account. So when I've described the key areas of policy in the way I've just done, we can point to specific aspects of things that can and should be done, and then leadership requires commitment to time periods, time scales for actually delivering. And then you've got something against which delivery can be checked and monitored and people held accountable. Now, let me then place my last few words on the subject of delivery. I've already argued that if we're to focus and monitor delivery, there have to be specific targets that have been set. And I gave the example of the elimination of hydrocarbon subsidies. And then, of course, we have to start taxing properly. Delivery requires the G20, having articulated the targets, articulated the ideas, to have ways of monitoring delivery. I don't want to suggest that the G20 can be the delivery mechanism, and I certainly would not suggest that. National governments and the private sector will be the main parts of delivery, but so too will international organizations like the World Bank, the regional development banks, the IMF, and so on. But the G20 can articulate not only the timescales for policies, but also where it expects those to deliver. The G20 leaders can say, we've articulated this story as a whole, this is how I'm going to do it in my country. This is how I'm going to give the right incentives to the private sector through the right kinds of public policies. In order for that to happen, The G20 needs more continuity than it has. Countries take it in turns, they gather in one place, there's a little bit of communication with last year, a little bit of communication with next year's country, but really not very much. You can't monitor delivery, you can't guide delivery with that kind of structure. You need a little bit more structure, not a great big bureaucracy, but you need methods for monitoring delivery, and that could be done by rolling three. I'll just give one example. You could have this year's G20 with last year's and with next year's, sitting down with the targets that were set and asking how those are going to be monitored. So you have a rolling monitoring system to encourage that kind of delivery. So I've tried to give a story through one example how the G20 can genuinely be more useful in tackling global problems. We have to be clear on the understanding and communications, clear on the strategy, and have genuine mechanisms for holding the people who've articulated that strategy into account. And that means monitoring of delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vamos a pasar a algo lúdico. Vamos a reencontrarnos con nuestros primates más cercanos, con los bonobos, que se dedican realmente a divertirse, a tener amor, relaciones sexuales, a jugar, a divertirse, a cooperar. Imaginémonos un mundo más tolerante, menos violento, un mundo lúdico. Isabel Benke, una gran investigadora de la Universidad de Oxford, la primera mujer que ha podido incorporarse en la República Democrática del Congo, que ha vivido más de 3 años entre estos hermosos primates. Isabel Benke es chilena, es inglesa, es ciudadana del mundo, pero sobre todo ha aprendido a través de los primates, los más cercanos a nosotros, lo que podemos aportar el día de hoy al G20. Con ustedes, Isabel Benke, bienvenida.
Wow, debo empezar con un gran wow, porque de todas las conferencias internacionales que he estado, TED, etcétera, etcétera, nunca he visto nada parecido. Así que realmente quiero agradecer y felicitar al gobierno mexicano por esta iniciativa tan fantástica. Ahora, iba a dar esta charla en inglés, pero parece que cambié de idea. ¿Pueden levantar la mano los que hablan español para saber? Ok. Vamos a ver cómo nos sale en español entonces. Rethinking G20. Nada podría ser más esencial en este momento. Rethinking G20 es rethinking lo que es el ser humano. Porque detrás de cada modelo social o económico hay un presupuesto de qué es lo que es el ser humano. Y claramente estos modelos no nos han servido bien. De manera que ya es el tiempo para un cambio de paradigma. Debemos repensar qué es lo que es el ser humano. De manera que mi objetivo en esta charla es que al final de ella quiero que sepan menos de lo que saben ahora. Esto no es una broma. Quiero que en verdad le pongan un signo de interrogación a lo que ustedes han tenido por verdades absolutas lo que es el ser humano. Además de eso me quiero atrever a plantearles a ustedes, distinguida audiencia, compuesta de tantos machos alfa y hembras alfa, que tienen mucho que aprender de la naturaleza y sobre todo de los grandes simios, nuestros parientes vivos más cercanos. Ahora, ¿quiénes somos los seres humanos? Somos sobre todo la especie que cuenta historias. Nos comprendemos a nosotros mismos a través de las historias que contamos. Por ejemplo, la gran pregunta de a dónde venimos, por qué somos como somos, intuitivamente entendemos que debemos observar y entender a nuestra familia, a nuestros ancestros. Por lo tanto, construimos árboles genealógicos. Sabemos que nuestros padres, nuestros abuelos, etcétera, han sido de gran influencia. Y lo que es cierto para el individuo también es cierto a nivel de especie. Este es el árbol genealógico. Ya vieron el pináculo de la evolución, el ser humano, obviamente. Y esto es cierto a nivel de especie. Es muy importante que entendamos nuestra posición en la gran red de la vida. Ahora, volviendo a las historias que contamos acerca de nosotros mismos, las narrativas evolutivas se han nutrido sobre todo de nuestro entendimiento de los chimpancés. ¿Quiénes son los chimpancés? Los chimpancés, al igual que los bonobos, son nuestros primos más cercanos. No venimos de ellos, somos primos, compartimos un ancestro común. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Hace 6 millones de años tuvimos una abuela evolutiva. Ahora, ustedes son muy educados y saben muy bien qué es lo que son 6 millones de dólares. Pero ¿entienden lo que significa 6 millones de años? Quiero que todos entiendan eso. Y me atrevería a decir que es lo que todos debiéramos entender. Hace 6 millones de años, entonces, vivió esta abuela evolutiva, de la cual venimos los chimpancés, los bonobos y los seres humanos. Entonces, como les decía, lo que sabemos de los chimpancés ha nutrido las narrativas de la evolución humana, sobre todo porque, uno, los conocemos mucho más a ellos, y dos, porque innegablemente compartimos muchas características, como por ejemplo, la agresión. Se conoce muy bien que los chimpancés viven en sociedades altamente jerárquicas, tienen grandes capacidades políticas y además exhiben comportamientos llamados protoguerra. O sea, no solo tienen encuentros violentos entre los grupos en los cuales puede haber infanticidio, canibalismo y asesinato. Entonces, esto ha fomentado y justificado visiones deterministas de lo que es ser humano, el ser humano. También los chimpancés construyen y ocupan herramientas, lo que a su vez ha hecho que entendamos la evolución de la inteligencia humana como mayoritariamente empujada por la tecnología. Y esto es cierto, o sea, tiene aspectos de verdad, pero no es la historia completa. Nos falta el otro lado de la moneda. Aquí es donde entran los bonobos. Los bonobos son nuestros otros primos, los que hemos conocido mucho menos, lamentablemente, ya que tienen un rol fundamental en ofrecernos una historia mucho más llena, mucho más holística de lo que es el ser humano. Y esto lamentablemente es porque los bonobos viven en un lugar muy remoto. Se encuentran solamente al sur del río Congo, en las selvas tropicales de la República Democrática del Congo. Es ahí donde yo ya he caminado 3.000 kilómetros en los últimos 3 años, tratando de entender el comportamiento social de esta especie y particularmente en relación a lo que podemos aprender de nuestro pasado profundo. Ahora, llegar ahí y la logística de cómo hacemos estas investigaciones es toda una aventura, pero creo que esa es una historia que la voy a dejar para otra vez. Estos son algunos de los individuos que yo estudio, es una comunidad de 30 bonobos. Los bonobos tienen una sociedad matriarcal que son famosos por ser muy pacíficos. Como decía Andrés, también han sorprendido por su uso del comportamiento sexual, que nos recuerda mucho a los seres humanos, ocupan el sexo en contexto no reproductivo. A diferencia de los chimpancés, no se ha observado agresión letal, o sea, ni infanticidio, ni canibalismo. También en los encuentros entre grupos, que yo lo he observado mucho, no hay asesinato, lo que es realmente inusual entre primates, y estamos recién empezando a entenderlo. Esto probablemente se debe al rol de las hembras. Aquí vemos a Kiku con su hijo Kiota. Kiku tiene 42 años y su hijo Kiota lo dio a luz el año pasado, a los 41. Es su 4º hijo. Las hembras además suben en jerarquía a medida que envejecen. ¿Por qué el rol de las hembras tiene este resultado en los bonobos? Si ustedes lo piensan, para toda hembra mamífero, la prioridad de una hembra es la sobrevivencia no solo de sus hijos, sino que de los hijos de los hijos. Eso inmediatamente tiene el resultado que las hembras tienen una perspectiva, 1, de largo plazo, y 2, de fomentar buenas relaciones sociales y sobre todo de mantener redes sociales de buena calidad. Lo que es muy distinto a las prioridades más cortoplacistas y competitivas de los machos. Aquí le estoy mostrando una escena familiar, lo que se ve todos los días en el interior de la jungla. Lo que ven es el macho alfa que está acicalando al hijo de Kiku. Los machos tienen un rol central también en la sociedad de los bonobos, no son para nada periféricos, son muy lúdicos, tienen mucha interacción con los infantes, sobre todo de juego, de compartir comida, etc. Ahora, una cosa es el rol de las hembras, estas hembras que no están emparentadas, pero que forman lazos y coaliciones muy fuertes entre ellas. Lo que también es muy importante en la sociedad de los bonobos es el comportamiento de juego. El juego, por supuesto, es universal en los pájaros y en los mamíferos. Pero en los primates se lleva a otros niveles de complejidad. Aquí tenemos algunas imágenes de juego en primate. Ese es Richard Feynman, un fantástico ejemplo de la correlación entre el juego y la creatividad. El juego sirve para cimentar relaciones, para prevenir conflictos, para mantener la creatividad, para desarrollar la capacidad de cambiar adecuadamente a contextos cambiantes, lo que es fundamental, y sobre todo para fomentar la confianza. El juego en adultos es algo que es más raro en el mundo animal. Pero si nos fijamos, vemos una correlación entre alta inteligencia, sociedades complejas y juego en adultos. Y no voy a hablar de eso ahora, pero creo que esta correlación, este trío, es algo que hay que prestar mucha atención. Tiene que ver con la plasticidad del cerebro y la capacidad de aprender de por vida. Ahora les voy a mostrar un ejemplo, un video corto, de la relación entre el juego y la confianza. Ahí ven una hembra que está sosteniendo un juvenil de la pierna y lo balancea. Esto está como a 20 metros de altura. Ya, ella lo podría soltar, pero no lo suelta. Vamos a ver el mismo ejemplo en un macho. Ahí lo ven, es un macho de 42 años. Como ven, los bonobos juegan de por vida. Tiene sostenido el juvenil. Ahora se va a volver a dejar caer, se está riendo. Los bonobos, al igual que los humanos, se ríen. Y además está disfrutando. Entonces, obviamente, esto requiere, pero a la vez fomenta la confianza. El juego está asociado a muchas características que son esenciales, además, para enfrentar los problemas que necesitamos enfrentar hoy en el mundo moderno. Ahora, no quiero que se vayan con la idea de que yo estoy diciendo, bueno, solamente si gobiernan las mujeres y jugamos más, vamos a salvar el mundo. No es obviamente tan simple como eso. Lo que estoy diciendo es que la naturaleza tiene principios, muchos de ellos son principios universales, de cómo, por ejemplo, mantener la salud y la cohesión en sociedades complejas. Y son estos principios a los cuales debemos prestar atención. Entonces, a través de conocer la naturaleza y en particular nuestro pasado primate, podemos empezar a construir una visión mucho más holística del ser humano, que sobre todo parte del entendimiento de la sociabilidad profunda del ser primate. Lamentablemente no podemos permitirnos perder este patrimonio. No podemos permitirnos esa estupidez. Tenemos que invertir en nuestro patrimonio biológico. Los bonobos, como muchas otras especies, están desapareciendo. Ahora, si pensamos, invertimos millones, billones de dólares en la exploración del espacio, en la astronomía, como una manera de comprender el lugar del ser humano en el universo. Pero tenemos el mayor repositorio de sabiduría en nuestro jardín y no lo estamos viendo. Se nos está quemando la biblioteca de Alejandría en nuestros propios ojos, lo estamos permitiendo. ¿Cómo nos podemos llamar inteligentes si permitimos que esto ocurra? De manera que, por favor, no seamos tímidos y repensemos lo que es el ser humano, repensemos G20. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. No seamos tímidos y repensemos lo que es el ser humano. No solo repensemos lo que es el ser humano, revivamos lo que es ser humano. Y una de las grandezas de ser humano es este juego de inteligencia, de valentía. Parte de la inteligencia es encontrar algo simpático y reírte con él y decir, le entendí ese chiste. La palabra del humor, que viene y deriva de este latín de la humedad, de la vida, del oxígeno, de lo que nos hace ser quien somos. ¿Por qué no nos relajamos un poco y a reírnos? Y después de ese momento de ser humanos, escuchemos al gran profesor Bhagwati. Por favor, a reírnos y escuchar posteriormente una gran plática del profesor Jadid Bhagwati.
Oh. Oh,
Thank you very much, my friends. When Andre Romer asked me to this function. He was looking for people with unconventional ideas, but he still didn't want to leave it to our imagination. So he made us come out of this box at the back. And I certainly can manage that, but what it really has helped me figure out is how a rabbit feels when it comes out of a magician's hat. And so for this, I thank Andres very definitely. This is also a country which I love, adore, and I'm going to talk a bit more about it down the road. But I also wanted to point out that I have lots of students over almost 45 years, MIT and Columbia. Many of them have gone on to do great things in public life in Mexico. And there are some here like Georgina Kessel, who holds the secretaryship of the Energy Department. And before that, it was another student from MIT, actually, called Yeshu Reyes, who is not here. So there are several who are not here also, and I suspect they've run into what we call in economics diminishing returns. They've heard enough of me by now, and they don't want to hear more. Actually, there's a story I tell about my student, lecturing to a large class, and one student had fallen asleep in the front row. So I asked the guy next to him, I said, would you please wake him up? So instead of waking him up, he said, Professor, you put him to sleep, you wake him up. So let me go on now to what I thought I was going to be asked to do. And I'm just going to spend a little time because we've had 4 presentations on the environment. Of course, we can never have enough. But in the morning, particularly the World Wildlife Fund, lady, Mrs. Smith, actually talked about cooking stoves and so on. And I thought she was going to talk about, since it was the World Wildlife Fund, she was going to talk about bulls and bears so that she could really marry into the discussion with the financial system. But, she and Mrs. Robinson were talking about a variety of very specific things. And my sense is that when you go to G28, G20. There's so many G's now. I have a letterhead which says G1 because I'm by myself. So you have basically presidents, prime ministers, and their Sherpas sort of getting together. It's too higher level of architecture for us to be discussing cooking stoves, for example. That is something best left to India, and I come from India, as you can see, and that's where, those are the kinds of things which, under the subsidiarity principle, we leave to lower levels of decision making. So I would say that's not there. So what I would like to sort of mention, particularly after the last 2 presentations, is that the architecture itself needs some additional support. And I think I admire both the previous speakers, they're also personal friends of mine, but particularly when Nick Stern said that we really have these dramatic possibilities which are facing us if we don't undertake action. My reaction is a bit like the one I get on international trade, which I'll turn to in a second very quickly, is that you really have the problem that you really, the more dramatic you make the scenario, the less credible it sounds. So I think in a way, if you want to carry people with you, don't overstate your case, even if it's not really an overstatement. And I think that's one important thing I would like to point out. Let me then go on to the international trade part. And there I think, again, as we heard, from the Google people earlier, what we need to worry about is the current situation and the current failures rather than thinking only about the future. Because if you look at the current situation, trade, for instance, which happens to be my special field, so it's close to my heart, that is something which has been completely decimated by lack of US leadership. President Obama got his Nobel Prize for multilateralism, but Doha round is a multilateral one, which was within his grasp. He never really fought for it, and it's collapsed. Protectionism is breaking out now, and I think the activists and the groups and the other leaders of the G20 ought to really put him in the dock when he comes here, instead of signing on to things like Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is actually even in violation of the Millennium Development Goals, if you really read them, instead of just citing them all the time, in general. Number 8 says we must have non-preferential trade liberalization. This is preferential trade liberalization, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mexico should throw it back in the face of the United States and say, look, this is not the way you want to lead. This is the wrong way to lead. And, we have to be able to say that. But will this leadership, which we enshrine at the G20, really come to terms with the realities? I'm not optimistic at all, because they will all be very polite to each other. And nothing really will be accomplished, I'm afraid. So let me put that aside, because I think Andres also had said in his instructions that I should talk about education and about the old paradigms being replaced by the new paradigm. Education, I would just like to say, make 2 points before I link it up with the new paradigm, which I want to talk about. And the education certainly is very important because you really have to impart values. I often say as a professor that we do research and augment knowledge, but we also have to teach our students how to practice virtue, not give them specific instructions on how to practice virtue, but to actually learn how to argue for the moral conscience and arrive at their own solutions. And that is something which is missing, I think, and that's where humanities instruction is very important. But the second thing, of course, is we don't really have anybody anymore, at least in where I live in the United States, anybody who's genuinely an international citizen. They hardly speak any foreign languages. There's a joke about 2 Americans at a curb pavement, and there's a guy who comes and asks them for instructions to get somewhere. So he says, "Parlez-vous français?" And they shake their heads. "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" They shake their heads. They go through Italian and Spanish. And so the guy drives away in disgust. So one of the Americans turns to the other and says, we should learn more languages. So the other guy says, well, what's the point? That guy knew so many languages. It didn't do him any good. And I think those attitudes have to change. And you see that in the Occupy movement also. Here are people, almost 99% of the 99%, who are actually part of the 1% in the world distribution of income. And many of them even say, we should stop trade, we should stop outsourcing, which really is actually a prescription for increasing poverty in the rest of the world, where the really poor live. Now, why are these people? These people are good-hearted. Most people are good-hearted, particularly when they demonstrate. But they don't have a clue about the world. And they actually act in a completely selfish way without realizing it. So we need education really to bring people up to snuff in this modern global economy. And the last thing I want to say is that in order to make the current situation, the current society viable, and that's where I think we need part of the old paradigm and partly a new paradigm. And let me explain to you, because I think today, with the IT sector and so on, you really have enormous awareness of wealth disparities. And people's aspirations are really being aroused. It's what I call the revolution of perceived possibilities. People are not just going to sit around doing nothing, accepting things fatalistically. So for the rich, I would take the old paradigm and say, look, we really used to have social responsibility by people like Rothschild and so on, but these are family-oriented firms. We now have to have corporate social responsibility. We also have to have personal social responsibility. I don't like just CSR, because that's sort of passing the buck on to a board of directors and so on. Each one has to practice it in their own life. And that's the only way you can really, bring something like concern for the poor, etc., into your thing. And we want to avoid conspicuous consumption. As I live in New York and go past Madison Avenue and Fifth Avenue, there's so much conspicuous consumption. You drive down to FAO Schwartz, we can buy $200,000 for your children. This is ridiculous in my opinion. So that conspicuous consumption has to go down. So I call it less excess, EXCESS. And for the poor is concerned, we need a new paradigm, because this was the old paradigm because in the 18th, 19th century, people really did practice this kind of concern for the poor. And, like in Simon Sharma's Burgers, where I come from in the state of Gujarat, where Gandhi came from, and there the Jains and Vaishnavas also practiced that kind. They accumulated wealth but never spent it on personal consumption. That's what we need increasingly. But for the poor, now that their aspirations are aroused, we need to bring them opportunity. And education is the only way to do it. And I think that is what is being undermined right now, because the high cost of education, IT sector can actually help you reduce the cost. Someone like me, I lecture 3 courses, and each course is $150,000 at least. And I'm supposed to give 1 course to 15 students. How can costs not go up with that? We don't practice technical change. I think we have to use technical change to bring it all down and make education possible. And this is what I call more access, CCESS. So what I've been recommending to my Prime Minister in India is to have a title, a little bumper sticker saying less excess and more access. And this is the combination that you need to make modern society, whether you call it capitalism or mixed society. That's the only way you're going to make the modern society viable and functioning. Unless we do that, we're in for trouble. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Señoras y señores, les vamos a pedir un enorme favor. Vamos a tener un break. Presidente, como moderador de la 4ª sesión de nuestro panel, les pedimos por favor que colaboren y que nos veamos aquí a las 4:10 en punto para ver un gran debate sobre el crecimiento económico. Gracias, aquí los vemos.